But I'm also remembering today a parable that David Foster Wallace included in a famous commencement speech. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" David Foster Wallace used that story to talk about many facets of awareness and empathy, but in a very specific way, privilege is also like that water. It surrounds some of us to the point that we can't possibly even be aware of it unless someone outside of the water tells us about it. Not long ago, I was one of the folks responsible for programming the monthly gatherings of the Humanists of Houston, the local chapter of the American Humanist Association. And we had invited Dr. Anthony Pinn, a professor at Rice University who writes a lot about the intersection of humanism and Black identity. He was speaking about privilege to a group of mostly white, mostly older, mostly male humanists. And just to remind you of the connection, the first Humanist Manifesto back in the 1930s is the origin of our first principle as Unitarian Universalists, that we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So Anthony Pinn is talking about that idea and about dismantling racism. He says that ignoring race doesn't help. Instead, we could be learning to honor people's stories. We need to affirm the experiences of people who are very different from us. And a white male responded, "Well, with you, that's easy. You're well-spoken, you're well-dressed, I can relate to you. It's different when I see some young thug with his pants down around his knees. I can't honor that." Now, Anthony Pinn is used to this sort of exchange, and he doesn't shy away from challenging people. So he asks, "Why do you care how someone wears their pants? Does how a person wear their pants make them more or less of a person? Because it sounds like you're saying I'm one of the good ones," which is both troubling and insulting. Sometimes we don't want to confront implicit racism. We don't want to recognize that there are some people who are existing outside the water of privilege that we're used to swimming in. Maybe it feels like we're going to lose something we need if we dismantle systemic racism. We'd rather say something like, "Well, I'm colorblind." We exonerate ourselves and brush off any responsibility. "I'm not personally racist, and that's enough." But if we continue to benefit from a system that puts other people at a disadvantage, it's not enough. It doesn't affirm and promote equity, justice, and compassion in all of our relationships for us to say, "I'm woke, I don't even see race." And I don't know what people intend when they say, "I don't see race," but I can tell you what some results are of refusing to see race. If we choose to be colorblind, if we choose not to see a person's race, we are saying that their history doesn't matter, that their culture doesn't matter, that their experience as a human being doesn't matter. We're saying that we aren't willing to see what it means for a person to be Black in America, for instance. All that matters is whether a person is good at fitting into our idea of what people are supposed to be. And unfortunately, for many of us, that translates to how well can a person assimilate into a culture defined by white ideals. People hear Black Lives Matter and respond with "all lives matter" because they don't want to talk about the specific challenges Black people face in the United States. They just want everyone to behave themselves according to the structures of power that already exist. Structures of power created by white people to benefit white people. So if you can fit in with white values and behavior and culture, if you can assimilate and adopt our way of being, then your life can matter too. When a white person says, "I don't see race," whether they realize it or not, they are saying, "I don't want to talk about racism because it makes me uncomfortable." They might also be saying, "I don't judge an individual because they happen to be Black. I judge their behavior or perhaps even their entire culture because it happens to be not white." See, when we're colorblind, everything looks either white or not white, which we often translate to acceptable or unacceptable, good or bad. We might not think of it that way because it's like water to us. Privilege, the normalizing of whiteness as the default, is all around us. It surrounds us and defines our experience to such a degree that we can't even see it. We need people outside the water to help us know what surrounds us. And even then, we might not trust what they say. They might have an agenda. They might want something. We don't consider that what they might want is equity, justice, and compassion, the same things we say we want. So let me give you just a sampling of what some folks outside the water have described. Here's a facet of white dominant culture you might not think about very often. How do you get what you want in life? How does a person get what they want in life? A lot of us base our answer to this question on what's known as the Protestant work ethic, which assumes that hard work is the key to success. This ethos also says work comes before play, and work and play are two distinct things. We might also think if you didn't meet your goals, you just didn't work hard enough. If you didn't achieve something, you might just be lazy. And yet there are some people who can work diligently their entire lives and never break the cycle of poverty on their own. A charter school in the Houston area used to have the motto, "Work hard, be nice." And after some thoughtful examination, the leadership of that charter school realized that they needed to ditch that motto. That motto, "Work hard, be nice," just didn't ring true. Their Black and Latinx students didn't just have to work hard. They had to work harder than their white peers. They couldn't just be nice because there is no amount of niceness that can overcome systemic racism. The school motto had originally been based on a facet of white dominant culture that assumes hard work equals success. And that facet of white dominant culture doesn't just hurt people who are marginalized. It's a way white folks express disapproval and convey a lack of compassion and inflict shame on one another too. Life isn't supposed to be fun until you've earned it. You have to work hard and prove yourself worthy of enjoying life. And then maybe, if you've worked hard enough, you'll have earned the right to play a little. And if you're trying to play, or you even look like you're trying to play before you've put in enough hard work, you will be judged. Musicians, artists, writers, creatives, video game designers, you had better make what you're doing look like hard work. You had better not look like you're enjoying yourself too much, because if it doesn't look like hard work, you're going to be ridiculed, dismissed, condemned. Everyone doesn't think that way, of course. But a lot of us would probably feel a little bit self-conscious if we admitted that what we do for work feels like play to us. A lot of us would probably feel a little shame if we admitted that we didn't work as hard as we possibly could have toward a goal. Nothing wrong with hard work, but people use the idea of a Protestant work ethic as a weapon of judgment sometimes. And it's a facet of white culture that we don't necessarily recognize as such. Other cultures have other ways of seeing things, not better or worse ways, just different ways. And other cultures might use their way of seeing things as a tool of social control too. But it's in acknowledging the possibility that there are other legitimate, worthwhile ways of being, that we begin to dismantle the oppressions within our systems and within ourselves. In acknowledging the possibility that there are other legitimate, worthwhile ways of being helps us dismantle the oppressions within ourselves and our systems. So what was that descriptor that Anthony Pinn pushed back on? Well-dressed and well-spoken. What does it mean for someone to be well-spoken? They speak proper English, right? Or adhere to the rules of the King's English. Maybe also use a fancy vocabulary, even if simpler words would suffice. In the United States, we also have some other rules about communication that are wrapped up in white dominant culture. We rely on a written tradition rather than oral tradition. We think that putting things in writing has more weight than a verbal agreement. In other cultures, someone giving their word might be understood as a binding contract. It's easy to take advantage of people who see things differently, even without necessarily intending to be deceptive. And then there's code switching. Have you heard someone talk about code switching? When Black students and students from other racial and cultural backgrounds too, when they go to college and want to be successful, many of them quickly learn that they'll get more attention from their professors and other university staff if they talk white. In other words, they have to adopt a way of speaking that may be inauthentic for them just to be taken seriously as students. But then around their families or friends, they have to speak in a more casual way, in a way that's acceptable in those social groups, or else they'll be ridiculed and shunned for talking white. They have to switch back and forth and be very keen about how to speak in different settings in order to be successful at earning a degree so they can have a career that will allow them to thrive. That can be very stressful and emotionally exhausting. Do white students have to do this? Maybe some of them do. But this need for code switching isn't even seen by a lot of people. It's not a public expectation. It's just part of the water. And if someone is outside the water, they can see it. But we're surrounded by it. And we might not even believe it if someone told us about it. Or we might think it's a reasonable expectation for people to have to speak properly, which is to say, speak the way we've decided we will accept and respect. In Anthony Pinn's book, When Colorblindness Is Not the Answer, he writes about learning from hip-hop culture. But it really isn't just hip-hop culture. It's also jazz, blues, electronic dance music, or house music. We can learn something from every musical style that originated in Black culture and experience. For one thing, these musical subcultures embrace a deep diversity. A lot of times, our sense of diversity, our sense of multiculturalism is just for show. We want to feel good about ourselves and point to who we've welcomed into community, but we still expect them to assimilate to the whiteness of our way of doing things. We want them to swim in our water. Deeper multiculturalism invites wisdom from different perspectives. Are there other ways of doing this thing we're doing? Are there other ways of building community with one another? Are there other ways of worshiping and celebrating and praying and speaking and doing ministry and being connected that are equally valid to what we are used to? And how can we draw on all of that diverse wisdom to create space for one another's stories and experiences and cultures to build a multicultural community rather than a community of multicultural people who have all agreed to do things the same way? Unless that's what we want. Maybe what we want is a bunch of people from different backgrounds who all agree to one right way of being. But if what we want is multicultural community, we have to let go of our sense that there is one right way to do things and develop an intentional openness to other perspectives and ideas. Not just theoretically, watching a video online about people in another part of the world and saying, that's interesting, those people have such a different way of doing things. but considering how we are in this community, how we might learn from one another a thick, deep multiculturalism that embraces a multitude of ways that we can build beloved community. Another lesson Anthony Pinn draws from hip-hop culture is the significance of the ordinary. In white dominant culture, the extraordinary is exalted. We celebrate grand figures and moments, people and experiences that stand out from the ordinary. Whereas so much of Black art celebrates the mundane, ordinary moments of life as precious and sacred. The experience of everyday life is important, significant, worthy of our attention. Slipping outside the water of our white dominant culture might mean refusing to insist on the extraordinary as the only valuable indication of importance. In allowing the mundane to be significant, we also might engage in another lesson Anthony Pinn hopes we can learn from hip-hop, and he calls it measured realism, which means that we acknowledge that our progress is contained in a context of pain and misery. In the music and art that emerges from Black experience, we see a willingness to embrace the tragic quality of life that encompasses all of our efforts to build a better world. Doesn't sound very optimistic, does it? We love feeling optimistic. We love feeling that what we are doing is bound to succeed, that we're entitled to that success if we work hard enough, if we persist, if we read enough of the right materials and understand it deeply and correctly, then we can have hope. And that hope feels vital to our cause. We must be optimistic so that we take that next step toward beloved community. Listen, the reason that we have a Black History Month is because the history of Black people in the United States has been overlooked and whitewashed and dismissed. A Black person in the United States understands that their way of being, their very existence, is viewed as a threat by many people who promote and embrace white supremacy culture. Even well-intentioned liberal folks might prefer to swim in the water of privilege than compromise their own comfort. So for a Black person to thrive in this country means to acknowledge that thriving is fragile. Life is fragile. Freedom is fragile. Every mundane moment is a potential source of joy, and yet it is encased in a tragic history of painful, bitter present. There's a long way to go before unarmed Black men don't have to fear being killed by the police. There's a long way to go before Black women can reasonably expect to be compensated equitably for their work. There's a long way to go before bad neighborhood isn't code for a predominantly Black part of town. There's a long way to go before we have a society defined by equity, justice, and compassion. And yet, even in the midst of that reality, we persist. That is hope. Not a naive optimism that everything's going to be fine if we just work hard enough, or even a willful ignorance about reality, looking reality square in the face with all of its tragedy and saying, we carry on. We keep building, we keep living, we keep celebrating. That is hope. Do you still how much we can still learn? Willingness to embrace the tragic quality of life offers us a better and deeper appreciation of humanity in all of its breadth and depth, in all of its colors. We cannot be colorblind and create a global community with peace and liberty and justice for every person. We have to see the fullness of human diversity and celebrate opportunities to build a complex multiculturalism into our communities of faith and our society as a whole. To welcome ways of doing things that challenge us and make us uncomfortable, rather than insisting that everyone do things the way we want them done in order to feel welcome. Remembering that discomfort is not the same as pain. Discomfort is not the same as pain. And we do not lose ourselves when we honor the legitimacy of other people's way of being. In celebrating the full spectrum of humanity, we discover that human differences are a benefit that can help us be more creative. Human differences expand our knowledge and perspective and help us shape fuller, healthier connections. And in seeing the full spectrum of humanity, we discover that we are capable of resilient hope that allows us to be fully alive with one another. May it be so in our community and in your life.